Hello photographers, my name is Spyros Heniadis and this is where I answer your photography questions. We learn about photography together. It's Wednesday and our first question this week comes from RickBSO, who says, can you please explain to me what the exposure compensation function actually does in the camera? So he says, I mean this mechanically. I understand that changing the exposure compensation over or underexposes the image, but what I don't understand is if it changes the f-stop or the shutter speed or the ISO or something else. And if that's the case, why can't you just change those settings manually yourself? So there's a lot there, and let's start by just establishing again that exposure compensation is a function on the camera that allows you to tell the camera to over or underexpose the image based on what the camera is telling you is a correct exposure. Because with your exposure indicator, the camera is always trying to get you to a zero exposure, but sometimes you want the image to be brighter, which is when you're going to overexpose the image, or darker when you underexpose the image. Now, what this does mechanically inside the camera depends entirely on the mode that you're shooting in. So for instance, if you're shooting in program auto mode, you set the ISO on the camera. So the camera is not going to change the ISO if you change the exposure compensation setting, but the camera has control of both the shutter speed and the aperture, and so the camera might change one or both of them depending on how it reads the scene and evaluates. And generally speaking, in program auto, the camera is trying to get you to at least 1/60th of a second for a shutter speed, which means that it will probably try to change the aperture if it can to maintain your shutter speed, but if it can't change the aperture, then it will also adjust your shutter speed in order to make the exposure compensation change that you've given it. Now, moving up the dial, if you go into shutter priority mode, you as the photographer have control of both the shutter speed and the ISO in shutter priority mode, which means if you're using exposure compensation, then the only thing the camera can change is the aperture. And then if you move into aperture priority, you as the photographer have control of both the aperture and the ISO, leaving the camera to change the shutter speed. So again, if you change the exposure compensation, the shutter speed is what the camera will actually adjust in order to over or underexpose the image based on your desire. Now, the last option is using exposure compensation in manual mode. And this is where exposure compensation doesn't really exist, except that it does in some cameras, which is kind of confusing. So generally speaking, in manual mode, you have control over all three of the functions, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, which means you are the exposure compensation function, and you would simply change your settings, whichever one you wanted, in order to over or underexpose your image. But I've run into some cameras that actually allow you to set exposure compensation in manual mode, which kind of confuses the crap out of me. I don't know why that would exist, because you just change your own settings, but it does. And the answer to what mechanically it does, I can't answer because that is a manufacturer decision, and it may change from camera to camera based on who actually allows this to happen in manual mode. But my guess would be that they would probably change the shutter speed. But that's a guess. That's a total guess. So that's how exposure compensation works, mechanically speaking, inside of your camera. It's entirely dependent upon the mode that you're shooting in. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed this answer to Rick's question, and if you have questions that you want me to answer, leave them down in the comments. And my question of the day for you is, what is the last movie you watched? Now, do me a favor, would you like this video and subscribe to my channel? If you really like this video, maybe share it with your friends, but the most important thing you need to do is get out there and take some damn photos using exposure compensation or not. I'll see you guys tomorrow. So there's a lot packed into that, and let's unpack that, starting with just reestablishing. So there's